as people, we tend to define ourselves by communities that we belong to. So this could be like by job or interest or family. But these are people that we share knowledge, values, and language with. And so we define ourselves in terms of these people. And I actually can't see you guys, so I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. But I wanted to ask you to consider if you thought of yourself as a science person, as someone who did science things. And as you think of that, think, okay, why or why not? Because I didn't think of myself as a science person when I was a kid. If you had asked me like what a science person was to 5-year-old Emmy, she would have said, well, those are the villains on all of my favorite TV shows, and they're on the news a lot, and I'm not quite sure what they do. So I wasn't really into that. I preferred being a nerd because nerds knew all the answers, and they were insanely good at trivia. So I wanted to be that kid. But I didn't look the part, I didn't look nerdy enough, and so I hatched a plan. I was like, okay, I'm going to ruin my eyesight so I can wear glasses. And so I would turn off the lights when I was doing homework and put my head up against the desk and just kind of write out all of the answers. And it worked! I ruined my eyes. And so now I can wear glasses and appear as nerdy as possible, and I regret this now that I'm an adult and have to pay for my own vision care. But at the time, it worked. But presenting this image of myself as a nerd also started, day one of every semester. I would go to class and I'd sit at my desk and have all my notebooks out and parallel to each other, and I would listen to the teacher, and I was the best student. But it was also really easy to be that student when you had a really good teacher. And I love watching teachers who teach like they're telling a story. And they just draw you in, and they help you see the content that they're teaching through their eyes. And I had a teacher like this in high school who taught biology. And he would just walk around the room while he lectured and would engage us all in the drama of life science. The origin of life stemmed in primordial soup, he announced at the beginning of the semester. And your textbook has a paragraph about creationism, but to believe in God or creation myth is stupid. You are a sack of cells, descended from cells millions of years ago. And this was granted engaging, and other people in the class were laughing, but this statement kicked me out of the story. Because besides having glasses and being a nerd, I had a more defining identity, in that I was spending every Sunday at the church down the road. And all of a sudden, this authority figure had said that I was a stupid sack of cells. And so I wasn't about to change that identity due to an insult, but I definitely thought that then science wasn't for me, and so I kept it at a distance. I still opted to major in biology when I was in college because my logic was, okay, nerd plus wants to help people equals doctor, which is very limited logic, but this is coming from the child who also said know-it-all plus intentionally ruins your eyesight equals nerd, and that's a good thing. So it's kind of to be expected that was my thought process. And so once I was in college, I started learning more about the sack of cells that the human body is composed of. I was taking more biology classes, and I learned that cells, some of the cells in our body, they make stuff and then spit it out. And we call that extracellular matrix. And they make these fibers, and they spit them out, and that's how we get stuff like bone and cartilage. And so on the screen, you see that we have bone. So if you were to take a bone lengthwise and slice off a really little, thin piece of it, and then put it on a microscope slide, and stain it, and then look at it, this is what you get. And so the big holes, that's where your vessels would be, like your blood vessels. And then the tiny little dark ovals, so it kind of looks like a tree trunk, right? And at the edges of those rings where you see those dark ovals, that's where the cells are. So the cells, they live in those little cocoons, and they just kind of spit out this bone around them. Isn't that cool? But essentially, most of what you see on that screen isn't cells, right? It's mostly that bone tissue. So, my high school teacher was incorrect. We are not sacks of cells. We are sacks of cells with sturdy bits holding us up. And that is how I held a grudge against a high school teacher for years, and then proved him wrong in front of all y'all. Thank you. Good night. So there's a little more. Because during this part of my story, when I was studying biology in college, I got to meet other science people. and recognized that this high school science teacher didn't speak for the scientific community. In fact, the science people I started to meet had married being a science person with being a religious person, which I thought was impossible. But these people were elders at local churches and also publishing in scientific journals. So I thought, okay, I can look a little more into this. And the more that I think about it and that I continue to study this, I realize that both science and spirituality are rooted in questions. But while science asks questions about what is happening, spirituality can ask questions like, why does it matter? And it's these questions and not the answers that drive both of these fields. Because if you have all of the answers, you don't need either. With answers, you don't need the questions of science. With all the answers, you can't have faith. All you would just have is facts, and that's kind of boring. All you'd have is trivia. And so Nerd Emmy was very unhappy when she realized that there was more to life than trivia. But it ended up being a good thing, because free not to have all the answers meant that I could start asking better questions. And I started to think about what it meant when we define ourselves as types of people, right? Because I hear various iterations of this, like, I'm not an artist, I'm not a writer, I'm not a math person, I'm not a science person. And I heard that last one a lot from someone who sat next to me in chemistry. Like, before every test, they would lament, I'm not a science person, I cannot do this test. And just kind of watched it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I watched that person suffering, and I thought, I wonder if there's a connection between what they're saying and how it's affecting their life. And so I'm actually now a graduate student at UNC, and I get to study. I get to research what it means to be a science person. And what I've learned from people who've been asking these questions about what it means to have a science identity for longer than I have is mostly that at the root of it, being a science person is feeling comfortable doing science things. So it's not having a degree or a lab coat or patents or even doing experiments. That does not mean that you're a science person. You don't have to do those things. And I have a reading list if you are a nerd and also want to read all the things and citations that I have. But for me, being a science person started with just watching birds. They're so funny. They're just little dinosaurs hopping around with their feathers and their beady little eyes, eating French fries off the ground. Anyway, so I watched birds, but then I started to incorporate a more scientific thought process into how I view the world. I started being more okay with not having all of the answers, and okay with failure, because I don't feel like people know this, but research goes wrong all the time, for no reason. It just goes so wrong, so fast. But then I also started to think critically about how to teach better, and how do my students learn. And then I started just asking more questions, like so many questions. I started my grad program with one, and then I got a stack of sticky notes, and then I started writing questions on sticky notes, and now there are sticky notes everywhere, in every book and notebook and drawer. I pulled some sticky notes with questions on them out of my couch cushions. Like, it's bad. It's bad, you guys. But I have a lot more questions now than I used to as a science person. And so I like this now that I'm a science person, but I recognize that not everyone has this warm, fuzzy feeling when they think about being a science person. It can seem really cold and othering. And I know that I heard things that made me feel like science was off limits to me, but that other people have heard similar things. You might have heard something like, you're not smart enough to do science. You're not going to get it. And I had glasses, so I didn't hear that one as much. But that didn't keep me from hearing things like, girls just aren't as good at science as boys. Or my favorite from someone just behind me, a total stranger, once was watching me fill up a water bottle, and they're like, don't your hands shake way too much to be a doctor? I was like, what? Why do you get to decide that? And so I get it. If hearing things like that makes you think, I can't be a science person. But I want to challenge that, because I argue that being a science person can enrich your life in really beautiful ways. Because you don't have to have a degree. Like, if you garden, or if you take a look around you when you're taking a hike or walking the dog, you're engaging with the natural world. in a way that's going to prompt discovery. Or let's say you bake bread. That's a science thing. You have to do a lot of science in order to make that happen. I haven't been able to figure out how to bake at altitude yet, so if you've figured it out, please find me and tell me how. Let's see what else. You could, if you parent, you're actively engaging in behavioral science, like every day. Like so much. There's so much trial and error that goes into that. And so doing science is unavoidable. And so if we're already doing it, and if our society is already so advanced because questions and generating knowledge and discovery pulls us forward into everything from like what we eat to how we treat our illnesses to how we look at the stars, then it behooves us to take another look and to dig deeper, even if it's scary. And so if you ever think to yourself, or you hear a friend say, or especially if you hear a child say, guess I'm not a science person, I want to challenge that, and I want to invite you to challenge that. Because that phrase doesn't capture that the ability to do science isn't predicated on gender or orientation, ethnicity, nationality, age, GPA, ability, or religion. I am not a sack of cells. And by reconsidering the boundaries of who I am, I was able to become a science person. And I wanted to share that part of my story because if someone has told you that you can't be a science person, I want to say they're wrong. You can be, and you're already on your way. Thank you.